So, yes, I throw up my little advert just in case anybody who's watching the live stream, which should be going out via kind of Facebook and various other places at the moment, wants to join us, they can join the Zoom. So today's session, we're looking at Matthew 8, verse 18 to 27. As I say, there's just a kind of a little string. Actually, no, it's not sorry, that was last week when we did the little string of miracles, called Small Faith, Big Miracles. It's there's the verses where Jesus addresses the lack of faith of his disciples. But actually that phrase, which I think is quite key, because it's into the context. It's almost it's been said that Matthew is written as if it's a discipleship manual. And as we're going to see, we've gone through this period, which is if you interlace it with the other Gospels, particularly Mark and Luke, actually there's a kind of a key moment, a key day, but it's representing the foundation moments of those who haven't met Jesus for the first time, because Matthew and Peter and Andrew, James and John, they've all met Jesus previously. Probably Matthew as well, who we're going to meet in a couple of weeks' time. But this is the moment where he starts calling them to follow him, to actually leave their nets. It's kind of costing them something to go into discipleship. And so we find in these verses some of these kind of both the benefits and the tensions are kind of being played out. So in terms of Matthew's structure, as I say, Matthew doesn't run in a kind of nice chronologically neat way. He's taken things vaguely from the same period, but he's put them together thematically, really, to kind of address certain points. And you really see that if you try and fit these verses into a kind of chronological flow with Matthew and Mark, as I said. In my own understanding as to how you interlace these things, I see Matthew as being the first gospel written. And actually, it's not been written to be a kind of a completely chronological narrative flow. It's been issued probably piece by piece, sermon by sermon, set of incidents, as part of what we think of as the apostles' teaching. It's what as they brought their group memory together and drawn it together, and as the church is growing instantly around Jerusalem and into Judea, so it's quite geographically close. It's been kind of put together for the sake of illustrating something or teaching something. So there are a couple of verses in this text which, if you look for them in for instance in Luke's Gospel, you find them in very different locations. But it's all from within this kind of first tour, which is the way Matthew has set everything we've read so far up. If you remember going back to Matthew 4, it talks about the calling of the disciples, first disciples, and it says, and then Jesus toured all over the place, and news about him went all over the place. And because of the way the modern world thinks, we then think that was an incident. Jesus went on this tour with everybody, everything happened, and then we come back and we get the Sermon on the Mount, and then we get these incidents. And these are all happening within the kind of, if you like, the purview or the context which Matthew has laid out already, which is that first tour. So that makes sense, hopefully. So verse 18, going back there. So now when Jesus perceived the multitude crowds around him, he gave instructions to depart to the other side. And so Matthew is giving us a sort of a quite a high level perspective, if I can put it that way. It's not that it's not kind of putting it in a chronological sense that Jesus gets up one morning, opens the door, and there's a massive crowd, turns around and says, we're going to the other side. It's talking about the general process, and understanding that there's this great crowd growing. We're going to see as we kind of tell through the story that crowd, particularly as you read it in the other Gospels, that crowd gets so big that it's difficult sometimes to move. But it highlights, if you like, in these early stages that there is something that Jesus is always looking for, which is kind of stepping outside of what is already looks successful. And then what we have is this little run of, if you like, what does it mean to be a disciple? And again, putting it into Matthew's flow, he's described this first tour, which is about collecting people who are interested. There are huge crowds, but there are those disciples. There are disciples that have gone up the mountain and heard the Sermon on the Mount. and which is probably, again, as we've talked about, if you compare with Luke, is probably being delivered constantly, that material, through this tour process with the disciples. And in this context, we have a couple of incidents, and this is where, if you try and be chronological, you'll find them appearing at different points in some of the other Gospels. So a scribe comes and says, "Teacher, I'm going to follow you wherever you go." And Jesus replies, "Foxes have holes and the birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." And so in Matthew's agenda, the discipleship agenda, he's already given us the very high view that Jesus takes. It's not an abandonment of the law, it's looking through the law, getting to something deeper, but when we touch that deeper thing, to hold it to a very high standard. So that it's constantly kind of drawing us towards that. So he set a very high standard in terms of the moral expectations of what it means to follow. And here, as we're about to hear, there's these huge crowds, but it's not particularly about the crowds. Jesus is looking to take his agenda. He's going to go somewhere else. There are people who are coming to him, and Jesus is making sure up front they're calculating the costs. So the foxes have holes, the birds of the air, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And although it's something we speculate on and try and kind of infer from the text, I quite like, I've only just started to watch it, but the Netflix series, The Chosen, or whatever it's called, isn't it? I've only seen the first few episodes, but I quite like the sense that they've introduced Jesus before the kind of public tour, as actually already someone who's often on the outskirts, kind of camping in his own space, being invited for meals and so on. And I suspect there's something of that truth right from the early point, as a kind of in his rabbinic ministry, Jesus is kind of allowing himself to what we sometimes refer to now to live by faith, rather than to live by his carpentry or building skills. But that's put up front for you, as a disciple, to recognise that this is not a stable place. It's not always going to be about the successes and the big crowds. It's not always going to be that you can make a living from it that seems easy. Sometimes there are those things we have to kind of walk into with our eyes open, so that our faith really means something. And then another of his disciples said to him, "First let me go and bury my father." So you'll notice in the context here, these disciples, as they are being presented, are being drawn out of the big crowd. So Matthew doesn't expect us to think that the first day Jesus goes up the mountain, preaches the Sermon on the Mount. Second day, he's got all these disciples. There's a process in here that belongs to this period. Let me first go and bury my father. And I've heard various things. I'm sure you have too. There's the issue of actually moving the bones from the grave once all of the degradable material, i.e. the flesh, has kind of gone from them. They put them into an ossuary. Is it that period that the person said, "We've buried him, we've got to wait and do that with him," or is it that he's thinking about, when I get the security of now being head of the household because my father has now died and I receive my inheritance? You can understand all of those things. They kind of make sense in the place that Matthew's putting them, which is the challenge, not to do what is always comfortable, but to understand what this journey, this adventure that Jesus is taking us on, might cost us. But Jesus told him, "Follow me, let the dead bury their own dead," which can seem quite harsh if you just kind of take it as a statement in its own right. But as we look back with the advantages of the hindsight, we see what an incredible opportunity this is. We don't know this disciple by name, and whether it is one of the 12. Jesus hasn't appointed the 12 yet, not in Matthew's Gospel anyway. But actually, what this person might miss out on, the privilege that this person might miss out on, if they wait that 6 months, is quite once you put it into its kind of context, you think, actually, no, that really does make sense. That challenge. It's not just a kind of a vain, provocative thing to say, "Cool, leave it. Doesn't matter about them. Come and do this now." It's actually, there is an incredible opportunity here that's not going to wait. So if you want to be part of it, you've got to move now. And all of that, I think, is therefore kind of implicit in Matthew's Gospel as it's being discussed by the early converts who are now being brought into that place of discipleship of all nations. That challenge is there. And then suddenly we kind of get this shift. So Matthew's thrown them in as a kind of illustration. They're just quite simply, they are about counting the cost of what it's going to mean to follow. And then we have this much more significant story. I say it's more significant because the story of the storm, which we're going to read, and then the demoniac, which we're not going to cover today, we'll do that in its own right next week. Is one of those stories that appears in all three of the synoptic gospels, and it's a kind of a key turning point moment, and we find it, although it's not explicitly pointed to, but it kind of there is an impact from it when Jesus feeds the 4,000. It's in the same region, so it has an impact where he leaves, goes across the sea to a more Gentile area, to an area outside of Galilee, into Decapolis. Which we're about to read about, and so it's a significant story, and again it has this issue of the challenge of discipleship and now of trusting of Jesus and having real faith in what it is we're setting out on our journey to do. So Jesus sets out. Behold, a great storm arose in the sea, so the boat's being swamped by the waves, but he himself is sleeping. And having approached, I always kind of find this language kind of is kind of amusing, because obviously a boat's not that big, but I kind of emotionally approached, and they awoke him and said, "Lord, save us, because we're perishing." So for those who have really committed to following Jesus, they get into the boat, they head on out, and now it's all going disastrously wrong. Very useful to address, I think. What the cost of discipleship is up front. Years and years and years and years ago, getting a very long time ago now, I started kind of ministry life as a youth worker. And one of the people I very much valued as a kind of a mentor was the guy with the unfortunate name of Winky Pratney. There's a New Zealander who worked with YWAM, who wrote a number of books on discipleship. But I always remember in having some conversations with him once, he said, because he used to work with people coming in off the street with drugs backgrounds, they'd often travel around the place, end up in certain centres, and he'd say, you get young guys become a Christian. He's got long hair, and he comes and says, "Oh, if I'm going to follow Jesus, do I have to cut my hair?" He said, "I always say yes, you do." He said, sometimes you get someone who's kind of been a bit of a skinhead and whatever, it's all shaved off, and they said, "Oh, do I have to grow my hair out?" "Well, yes, you do." And he said, whatever the presenting issue is that they want to know, do I have to stop it? I always tell them yes. And he said, because I've learned over the years, it's far better to have that discussion up front than it is for them to kind of say, no problem, because eventually there'll be something they want to ask that question about that does matter. He said, so it's far better, it's far more efficient from my point of view, is whatever they think might be a problem, say, yes, you've got to stop it now. And I've always kind of thought, when I think about this passage, there's a bit of that's going on in this process, is count the cost up front. Don't get off on the journey halfway and then think it's tougher than it's too tough and I'll bail out now. Better that you think, you recognise it could get tough, then you set out and it's not so bad. And in a very real sense, because I find it, it's been one of those things that for long. Obviously my own journey with the Lord kind of goes back, for me, one of my significant moments was being healed of a terminal cancer when I was in my teen years. People often say to me, "Oh, if that happened to me, then I'd be a Christian like you are." The sad thing for me very often is, because I recognise during that process, although when I tell the story, I can actually identify a kind of a period where you can almost pretty much say that the cancer disappeared overnight. There was a real turning point moment, but actually we only saw that with 3 months of hindsight. There was a kind of 3-month period where actually the news was all bad as results kind of come back after time, and there's this kind of delay period. And during that period, I had already made my peace with the Lord, if that makes sense. And I'd come to a conclusion. I expected to die. I didn't want to die, but I expected to die, and yet I had come to a place of peace with the Lord in that context. And it's been one of, I mention that because it's a real grief when people have had a very privileged life and then they hit their first disaster and their faith disappears. And I'm not being at all judgmental, because I really don't want to hear it that way at all. From a pastoral point of view, it grieves me that in one sense that their faith has been so centered on what they've got out of it, that the first time there's a challenge, it kind of dissolves. And as I say, I don't say it with judgment. Oh, what a bad Christian they were. It actually is I recognise it's a very natural human thing. You know, it's tricky. We have been born into a context which is unusually peaceful in an environment, a European environment, that has had some of the benefits of the gospel, leaving institutions that do so much for us, that our lives are very non-challenging in the big picture. And so when we hit those things, we suddenly see it as a failure of the Lord, and that for me is a real grief. But I think it's not an unnatural process. It's the kind of the curse of too easy and easier life, is you don't really appreciate the qualities of life for what they are. You just appreciate the pleasures. So I don't want to get drawn off unnecessarily, but I think some of these things are really what Matthew is driving at here in the cost of discipleship. So we're now suddenly, actually, it seems that Jesus doesn't care at the moment. He's just sleeping through it. We followed him. We took on all his warnings. I left my parents. I didn't bury them. I worked out that I wasn't going to have a stable income. I stepped off on this journey. But now we're here, and Jesus seems to be asleep and doesn't care. And Jesus says to them, "So why are you afraid? Are you small-faithed?" Then, having risen, he rebuked the wind and the sea, and there was great calm. And so the people marveled, saying, "What kind of thing is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And so we have this quite phenomenal sort of quite shocking miracle. The reason I say it's shocking is because there are a number of the big nature miracles, which when you look at them in the context of some of the Old Testament, are kind of clear declarations of the divinity of Jesus. He's more than just a prophet. He's more than just a good rabbi that is which of course is where he's started from. He is that, but there's a lot more going on here. And suddenly we're confronted with this, which in its own way is quite a shock. But actually, it raises more questions in one sense. If he can do that, even if the wind and the sea obeys him, why doesn't he do that in other ways? And I think you get a little bit of the tension of where, if you like, the authority of Jesus. It's not whether he has it or not, but where he chooses to apply it. In the very kind of context that we've started with these multitudes which Jesus needs to leave. We come into a storm, but in the storm Jesus has command and control. But we're going to finish this story. We're going to next week we're going to think about the demoniac, who Jesus is going to say, "Don't spread the news." Actually no, that's the one time he does say spread the news. It's the other wrong way around. But actually is in the context as Jesus comes back, of being crowded by people, and the people are difficult. But the difference is in their difficultness, which is more human level difficultness. It's a much more of a drain on Jesus. It's much more emotionally sapping, and he doesn't just stand up and speak a word and they all fall over and whatever. He actually deals with them and engages with them. And that has an incredible moment in it. But as I say, I think sometimes we miss those moments because we're so used to the stories. Here is Jesus. He seems to be successful. There are lots of crowds. And then he says in his success, "I'm going somewhere else." So he's not so interested in that. He's going to come back to them. He makes sure they understand the challenges. When they get there, suddenly he doesn't seem to be alongside them anymore, and they're losing in faith. But then he demonstrates what he can do in that kind of natural realm. But as we're going to see as it comes back, there is something where he deals with individuals and with people in a very different way, which should tell us something about his mission if I put it that way. Which is much more interesting in its engagement with people than it is in just proclamation of what's true. So anyway, I don't want to be too provocative, so I'll just leave that hanging there at the moment. Oh, there we go. Thanks for watching. We've kind of covered through what I really just wanted to cover today. But hopefully you kind of, as I say, for me, it helps, it makes sense of the agenda that Matthew's got. And we see it kind of as he's been laying it out, the challenge of discipleship, what you're being discipled into, how you're going to go about it, what's going to cost you, even when it sometimes will feel like Jesus isn't there, because there's something about what Jesus is doing, how Jesus deals with the natural supernaturally, but he deals with people naturally, if that makes sense. And there's an interesting tension in that place. So anyway, I don't know if anyone wants to ask any questions or just make any other observations or clarifications at this stage.
I have a comment. I'll come back to the first point on let the dead bury their dead. I did have an observation that in certain Middle Eastern cultures, that is a typical procrastination comment, and that the chap's father had not yet died. He was just saying, well, I'll put it off to some time in the future.
Yeah. And so that's why I say I'm not fully sure, because I've heard two things. One is he's not died and I'm waiting and we'll get whatever, and others which is, the burying actually is a long process, because you bury the body, then you remove the bones and so on. So, but I think generally, yes, it's just a procrastination. Thanks, Steve. Any other thoughts or comments?
I thought it was interesting about, I know you brought this up in the past about Jesus not doing lots of miracles. We think of comparing that with people with so-called healing ministries that go around and do loads and loads of stuff, and that's quite different to Jesus. Really, he seems to do one here and one there, as opposed to look at me, I'm a great healer and worker of miracles. It's almost like he shied away from doing it. Yeah.
So there are definitely occasions like we've had last week where everyone who's brought to him, he heals them. So that, but it's not. He seems to try and leave that as separate to this other sense of agenda and so on. It's not the main reason that he's come for, if that's the right thing. And although it was often more, having kind of worked in both in heavily evangelical streams and in heavily Pentecostal streams, I recognize the pressures to be one thing or another very often in those ways. But one of the things I used to I would still say regularly is I went through a phase where I seem to get a lot of kind of prophetic words for folks, and then you get people who kind of want to literally turn up and say, prophesy over me, and I genuinely feel it, because I used to feel it inside, and I'd say it and try and explain it to folks. Is you get it, you're now being challenged to perform, if you like. So it's now about the performance, not about the person. And so I would often say, I can't do that. I can't just do that. But actually, one of the things you can do is you can be encouraging. And I can easily see how people can kind of get slowly sucked in, where you're getting challenged. Do this for me. Start with a word of encouragement, because often the word of encouragement does become something prophetic. That's just the way it goes. But actually, if we kind of fall into that's what I'm here to do, we end up focusing on the blessing rather than the blesser. And like so many things in life, there is a strange kind of tension. When we pursue fairness, we don't get it. When we actually allow ourselves to be changed, and we actually become a fairer society, if that's that kind of thing. Sometimes to get what you think you want, you can't pursue that thing directly. You have to focus on the inner challenge. So, but yeah, no, it's a complicated thing, I think. It's the challenge of the book of Job, which is, does Job only worship you because he's had such a good life? That's the whole challenge, isn't it, of the that is kind of put to the Lord by the adversary in Job. And yet, even when everything is stripped away, he continues and says, even when his wife says to him, "Why do you still worship the Lord?" I'm very grateful for not having a wife who's like that, who's encouraged me to stick with it when things get tough. But that is the challenge. If you only serve the Lord because it's good for you, it's really just a sort of self-centeredness. That's not unsurprising, because we are made with a sense of autonomy, so we are more focused on ourselves than we are on other people. That's just part of the nature of being human. But we're supposed to be challenged beyond that, and so somehow our pleasure can't be the ultimate thing we're aiming for. Anyway, any other points? That was a good one, Neil, though.
I think it brings out, I think you brought out in the passages, is the seasons of difference. Sometimes he's healing everyone, sometimes he's healing just one person and leaving everyone else, and so, as you say, everyone's coming to him, and suddenly Jesus says, "Well, no, I've got to go over there." It just reinforces that way, that God's ways are not our ways. And I think it seems to be that once we've understood what God might be doing, he then says, "Well, but there's more," and changes it all again. And I think for me, it really comes down to this idea: it's a relational person. We're following a person rather than following a set of do this, do
rules
that,
and principles.
do that.
I 100% agree, Gareth. Yeah, totally right.
The one other one that I know, I love the parallel passage in, I think it's Mark, where it talks about how Jesus, he rebukes, I think, the wind.
Yeah,
and speaks peace, doesn't he, to the sea? So it's sort of as if, to me, that there's an understanding of some things are antagonistic towards, and there's other things that you have to resist, and there's other things that just need to be blessed. And I guess I don't know if you've got any insights into that, in terms of that sensitivity, spiritual sensitivity to, because I guess even some of the questions that you get asked, as you say, someone comes up and says, "Prophesy over me."
Yeah.
Sometimes it's, you have to, that they're doing it from a very selfish ambition, but there's other times when they're nearly doing it out of a desperation.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. Yeah, and the thing is, like with children, if you think of it like that, it's a very patronising way of putting it, isn't it? But for us as adults, but it is like with when your kid says, "Can I have an ice cream?" you don't say no every single time. There are times when you say yes, and there are times when you say no. But their reasons for asking may, for them, feel exactly the same. I just want an ice cream. So there is something about even how people approach and want their demands and so on. I really feel strongly, and I want to internalize. You don't blame people for being where they're at right now. The challenge is always, but how can we move on from here? How do we grow from here? How do we take what we've got? And that's part of the more that slightly bigger issue of judge not lest you be judged. And what does it mean not to be judgmental and yet to be discerning? What does it mean for Jesus to challenge in certain contexts? But what it really comes down to is do I meet the person where they're at, actually meet them, make contact with them, and we try and change? Or do I look at it, judge where they're at, and stand back and don't go there, if that makes sense? And I think, unless we engage, the other week when we were saying, it's that Jesus touches him first and then says, "I'm willing." It's not kind of let me think about it. Okay, I'm willing, now I touch. But it's a very different dynamic where we make real connection, and so I take these things on, you observe them, you think, how does that affect me? How does it change me? If I fail in those things, I'm not going to live with a great burden of it, because I understand the grace that is in the story, if you like, that I'm not going to use that grace as an excuse to say, actually, that I can do what I like, however I like, when I like. I want to take these things on board seriously, try and ingest them, make them part of me, but not allow them to become a sort of spiritual pride thing either. So that's
Interesting. Can I make an observation?
Yeah, go on, Julian.
I love what you said about supernatural and natural. I went to buy some sultanas with my mother about an hour ago, and I said, they said natural sultanas. So I said, "Have you got any unnatural ones?" and it caused a bit of a stir in the thing. But I don't want to get off the point, but I think Jesus leaves a window open for us to debate, because I think there's a tendency that think, oh, I've got Jesus now, I've sorted with Jesus. But I think what's interesting, picking up what you were saying, Gareth, that like the selfishness, I think we've got to be careful with tone and delivery and understanding the root of anybody that might be struggling with certain aspects of the Bible, for example. And I was minded by someone mentioning about the, spare the rod, that bit of scripture that one say, God, what a severe God, spare the rod, don't spare the rod, or whatever it is. But when you dig a bit deeper, someone was saying that it was the rod is for shepherds to actually use to allow sheep to be aware, testing the rod in the ground, that they don't fall and break their ankle. And that really took a massive spin on this issue of spare the rod. And, people pick up a bit of scripture and run with it without actually really sharing perhaps the beauty and the eminence of God or Jesus or the Spirit. So you can have a good debate and enjoy and get some nectar out of the scripture rather than it being used as a weapon. Any thoughts on that, Kristen?
Well, I know, because for me, some of you be aware, I've got a little kind of interview video with Greg Boyd on my channel, and I love he uses an image which I used to use myself, but then he's now said it on my own channel, so I can't use it, of the magic eye pictures, where you look at them and they look like a mess, but you have to look through them, and then you suddenly see something, and once you see it, it's really kind of concrete and whatever. And he kind of points out has been part of Christian theology since the days of Origen, which is that actually the really valuable truth is below the surface. And actually the thing I quite like in the way Greg puts it is, when you look at the cross, we've so conditioned ourselves to see the cross as victory, we don't realize what a mess it is. The reality is that the Lord has allowed his deep revelation to be covered in a horrible veneer, in one sense, and that's true of the cross, that Jesus dies as a criminal under a curse. According to the law, according to the religious system, he is most cursed. He looks foolish to the Romans. He's the first ever, one of the first concrete things is a mocking of Jesus as a crucified donkey on a Roman, scribbled on a Roman, by a Roman soldier. That we see it differently to the way it was experienced, and that was the message, that this looks like a mess, but if you see through, can you see what God has done? He's endorsed a life that world and religion has written off. And that actually that principle, if we see Jesus right the way through the Bible, we often find that the deeper truth is, you hear spare the rod, spoil the child, and it's all about beating the kid. As you look a little bit deeper, it's actually like a shepherd. If God is like a shepherd, and he uses his rod in a prodding and nudging and a guiding and a sort of a way, but you don't see that unless you look a little bit deeper. You have to go a bit through. So I think it's part of the maturity that we bring to our Bible reading is to try and always be pushing out our understanding of its context and how it relates to other things and some of the tensions it creates. So I love the bits that seem to create tensions, because it's often in trying to understand the tension that you see them in a more nuanced kind of a way. Sorry, I do this same thing. You're actually over there, Julian, but on I've got a screen over here, so I look at you over here. But anyway, yeah. So
you'll always be in a better place, Kristen.
But I think the general rule is kind of like we read scripture and we think about scripture, and doing that is a healthy thing to do, rather than to kind of sift through it at a very shallow level, trying to look for the rules and then trying to impose that on other people. That always seems to me to be non-productive.
I think you brought that out for me for the first time, where we're saying to that person about burying the dead. In another scenario, that might have been okay for him to hang around and bury the dead. Yeah. But as you pointed out, that was just before. He would have missed a key year of Jesus' discipleship. So
and what would most of us here do if we said, you might have to sell your house, but you can come and you get to go backwards in time and experience that year? I think
Yeah, tempted, wouldn't we?
It would be. Then you suddenly realise, okay, I'd have to talk to my wife and kids about that. Suddenly it becomes very real. So
I had a question, Kristen.
yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about when you mentioned about the calming of the storm and how that often is seen as something that shows Jesus' divinity? I always find this quite hard to square the circle, because Jesus is just living as a man.
Yeah. If you want my broad brushstroke situation, I see the victory of the cross is achieved in Jesus' humanity. I understand that as actually is mankind makes the mess in the first place. Is the responsibility for mankind. They can't do it, but God takes on our humanity. In his humanity, he fixes something. But actually the ascension and the resurrection, in one sense, is an expression of Jesus' divinity, because actually he still has something of that. And I can't give you simple rules on how it means, but Jesus allows those bits to pop out only in very specific kind of, it seems, contexts. So I'm therefore aware it doesn't kind of, when you draw with the broad brushstroke, there are details that are hard to kind of to modify. There are quite major miracles that are achieved by people like Moses as well, but in one sense they as we see God with Moses in the going through the Red Sea, so he's before and behind. And actually Jesus makes a distinction to his disciples about God with you and God in you. And so there's some of those things when I say about the divinity, but if we try and if we were to really be able to forensically analyze it, it's kind of in that God in him, in his humanity, is so aware of the possibility and right now the authority he can wield through his humanity, because God is with him rather than him being God, etc. Somehow those things at certain points, for instance, like the walking on water, water into wine and so on, which kind of are more clearly to a Jewish context, speak about God is here rather than someone's got healed, which is much more of a kind of a hands-on, literally hands-on, isn't it? kind of ministry of the prophet and so on. It's a moment where God is acting. So when when Elisha kind of prays for the widow's son and he comes back, he's very involved in that human level, in his humanity, but operating supernaturally. Whereas when they come through the Dead Sea, God is with them, and because of that, something has happened. So it's a very much a sign of the Emmanuel, God is with us element. But there's something about the human life that Jesus is leading that he does in his humanity, so that the cross itself is something about humankind has fulfilled what God has always intended for it. And the way I've often say it is it only requires one human to fulfill it for it to have been fulfilled. It only requires one acorn to produce a new oak tree for the oak tree to have succeeded in reproducing. Even though it produces millions, the next generation comes from the one. It's that kind of that tension. So difficult to be totally forensic about, but then so's wave particle duality in physics. Our heads don't always get those things where you have things that aren't contradictory but are intention. Truth in tension is difficult for us to get our heads around. Good. Yeah. Well, we've spent a bit of time today. I said it's a short one today. So the passage was short, but we've talked a bit. But it is really good to see everyone again.